Genesis 3 to 11 shows us how God deals with human sin. And it's not just the original sin of humanity, but then the consequences of that as it begins to work its way through the whole of creation. That climaxes in the story of the flood. The story of the flood is God's attempt, or God's act, to put limits to what human beings can do to his creation. And a fresh start. He hasn't eliminated the problem of sin. After the fall, people are equally sinners as before the fall. You remember when we were looking at the story of the flood? God grieves because every imagination or thought or inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. Wonderful statement of original sin. The whole of humanity is riddled with the consequences of rebellion against God. And the same thing is said after the flood. So both before and after the flood you have that sentence. But after the flood, God deals with sin in a new way. And we see that in the story of the flood itself. First of all, God accepts the sacrifice that Noah offers him. Now, that sacrifice points to God's ultimate plan for dealing with human sin. That God himself deals with it by means of sacrifice. Now, there's just the beginning of that with Noah's sacrifice, which points to the sacrificial system at the temple, Exodus and Leviticus, and that in turn points to the great sacrifice of Christ. So in the post-flood period, sacrifice is important. But then secondly, God makes a commitment. Secondly, God gives permission for capital punishment. Now, capital punishment doesn't remove violence. It doesn't eliminate violence, but at the best, it contains it. It limits it in a way that is fair and just. An animal kills a human being, that animal may be killed. One man kills another man, only the murderer may be killed, no member of his family, and that's the end of the story. Permission is given for capital punishment. And God also gives human beings permission to use animals as a food source. Now, this paradoxically has two results. On the one hand, it puts the fear of man in animals, and human beings begin to get control over the animal kingdom in the way that they hadn't before. But also there's a vested interest in human beings in not eliminating their food chain. So no farmer is going to kill all his sheep. He'll only kill as much of the flock as is economically viable. Can you see the way it works? So there's a vested interest. Animals benefit from human beings, and human beings benefit from animals.
And you want to make sure they're not sick.
There's lots of things that follow from this. And then thirdly, most remarkably, God makes a covenant with, not just with Noah and every single human being without exception, Noah, who is the second Adam, but he also makes a covenant with every single living animal on the face of the earth. The animals benefit from the covenant that God makes for the stability of the world and its seasons and its fruitfulness. The ecological covenant, to use a modern term, for the stability of the ecological system. It doesn't mean that human beings won't muck it up, but God promises that never again will there be a flood that inundates the face of the earth. I find it very interesting that the consequence of global warming is flood that inundates the face of the earth. Just by the way, if you look at mythological and legendary material from people all over the world, there is a memory of a primeval flood all over the world, quite even from parts of the world that have no connection with the Old Testament and with the Quran, which teach about the primeval flood. That's just by the way. You can make whatever you want to of it, but it's there's a memory, a human memory, that's passed down of a flood that inundates the face of the earth.
That comes up in Vedic religion too.
Sorry?
It's interesting to see that come from Vedic religion too.
Vedic, yes. Look, you're very, very early. So, but you'll find it in some Aboriginal groups. You'll find it in groups in Africa, all over the world. It's a very important part of Babylonian religion, the story of a great flood, and of a man and his family who were saved at the time of the flood.
Yeah.
Yes?
I was just going to say, yeah, every ancient civilization has the one family.
I don't know with everyone, but most of them do. There's no doubt some exceptions, and I think scholars have pointed out there are some places, but just because they aren't recorded doesn't mean that the memory wasn't there. Now, however, just in case one gets illusions about what's achieved and not achieved in the flood, after the story of the flood, you get the story of the Tower of Babel. And I get problems here with this jolly machine. I think that's the best I can get. It's fairly small print, but you've got it in any case. After the flood, Noah's family grows, and from Noah's family you get the table of the nations. All the main national groups come from Noah and scatter all over the face of the earth. And the central group there is the Semitic nations that come from Shem. Three main big families. But then comes the story of the Tower of Babel, which, if you like, is a second fall. Now, to understand this story, which is very, very veiled and presupposes a lot, you need to understand something about Babylonian religion and to see what is being hinted at here. I think I've mentioned already on a number of occasions that everywhere in the pagan world, mountains have special significance. Mountains are places where heaven and earth overlap. And the gods, at least the sky gods, have their home in the mountain of God. So there is the mountain of God, which represents the heavenly realm. So take, for example, Canaanite religion. El, the chief god in the Canaanite pantheon, has his home, his residence, his palace on the mountain of El, the mountain of God. Now, mountains then as places where heaven and earth overlap. So if you want to enter the heavenly realm, you go up the mountain of God, and by the mountain of God you have access to the heavenly realm. Well, the Babylonians lived on the plain of the Euphrates, not Tigris, Euphrates. It's flat land. They have no hill there. They need a temple, and they want to have access to the chief god of the Babylonians. And so they build a ziggurat. Have you heard of the Babylonian ziggurats? They're still everywhere in the Middle East. You get remnants of these ziggurats. These are man-made mountains made of clay. And those mountains were, in fact, ziggurats were not just towers. or step pyramids, but they were the mountains of God. They were temples. Ziggurat because they were a stairway up into heaven. Now, the only people that were allowed to go on top of this stairway, Ziggurat, and the Ziggurat in Babylon was in fact called the Gate of Heaven. Was the king who was also chief priest, and together with the other priests of Marduk, the Babylonian god. So once a year, at least, we don't know the great details, but we know that once a year, the king, together with his priestly entourage, would go up the Ziggurat and present offerings. And the offerings, then, as part of the offerings, they would consult the omens. They'd open up the animals that were offered, and they'd look at the entrails of the animals, and particularly the liver of the animals, to determine what was, to discover the will of the gods, or the destiny for the next year. Likewise, astrology was part of the deal. Astrology, which is religious, the priests would go up the Ziggurat to observe the stars, the constellations, the signs of the zodiac, to determine what was going to happen. Their destiny, the will of the gods. And in this way, human beings were in fact entering what? The heavenly realm. That have privileged secret knowledge of the workings of the universe, and they could manipulate events here on earth. So did you make war or did you not make war? Did you make this decision or that decision? By means of astrology and divination, they could discover whether they would be successful or not. They would enter the heavenly realm. Now look at the wording of the sin of Babel. Michael, could you read chapter 11, verses 4 to 5? You get the key verse there. No, Genesis 11, 4 to 5.
Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built.
Can you get the irony there? They want to build a tower that reaches up to heaven, this great big imposing tower, and it's so tiny that God has to come down on his knees to see this pinprick of a tower. The tower, the Ziggurat. From a human point of view, if you read this story with secular eyes, without knowledge of the religious background, this seems a rather harmless project. Now, they want to build a city, they want to consolidate themselves. Instead of having individual power, they want to create a state and pool resources to become powerful and to stop themselves from being dispersed and scattered over the earth. If you want to be strong as human beings, you've got to pool resources. If human beings are divided, they become weak. But collectively, corporately, they become strong. Now, this is the temptation, a great temptation, of politics, if you like, or the state. Where the state, politics takes the place of God and pretends to be divine, divinizes itself. It's the great temptation of all politics, but took particular form in the French Revolution. The point of the French Revolution was to abolish all religion, but what took the place of religion? Politics, the national state. Now, this was the nation state, so a particular nation, the French nation. The Russian Revolution went one step forward from that. They wanted to abolish religion, but instead of just making a nation state, Russia, they wanted to make a communist empire. So that communism would take over the whole of the earth. So that communism is inherently international in its dynamic. But this is still a temptation of Americans and the British and every superpower that's come along in its own way. But here it's quite concrete, you see. The people of Babel together want to ascend in the heavenly realm. They want to join the gods in heaven. Now, so you see that this is a repetition of the sin of Adam and Eve. What did Adam and Eve want to do? They wanted to become like gods. Now, what these people want is divine power. They're not interested in divine status. They just want the power, technological, political power, so that they can control their destiny. That's the important thing. They're in control. And they don't have to depend on anything apart from themselves. That's the sin. The arrogance, assuming divine status and power. God's reaction to it is very, very interesting. His judgment is that he confuses language. This will only work provided you are able to communicate. You have one language. You have a common means of communication. God confuses the languages. Please excuse me. People can't communicate with each other, and so people are scattered the face of the earth. Now, what's beneficial about that scattering? If you get various ethnic groups together, different languages, different cultures, what you're going to have? War. And so they scatter. And paradoxically, this fulfills God's purpose for them. Because originally they wanted to avoid filling the earth. Now God gets them to fill the earth. Remember, the part of the blessing that had been given to Adam was be fruitful, multiply, and what? Fill the earth and subdue it. So God's judgment is in fact a merciful judgment, and by means of that his blessing is fulfilled. He brings blessing out of human sin. But the problem remains, and notice at the heart of the problem here is that the Babylonians want to make a name for themselves. It's not just power that drove them. It's not, if you want to understand politics, you don't just see that politics has to do with power. If you want to understand our modern society, the way it works, it's not just that people are after power, but they want something more intangible than that. What do they want? Name. The Hebrew word here is the name for themselves. They want glory. That was the Roman word for it. They want status, reputation. They want to be somebody.
And there's a seeking immortality to it.
Yes. It's the most that you can have in the face of death. So that even though you die, what will happen? Your name continues, your glory continues. So even though Alexander the Great died, a young man, 33 or 34 years old, his name will never be forgotten. Well, so paradoxically will Stalin's name never be forgotten. And Pol Pot's name, maybe Mao Zedong's name will never be forgotten. Right? Name, reputation, fame. Now take notice of that. It's a bit ironical. They want to make a name for themselves instead of what?
Praising God's name.
Instead of focusing on God's name, living for the glory of God. And if they live for the glory of God, then in fact they will have a name for themselves.
As Abraham did.
Okay, and then I want to lead into the call of Abraham, because immediately after this you get God's call of Abraham. God gets him to commit suicide, to become a nobody. And what does God promise him? I will make your name great. I will make your name great. So we don't know the names of the Babylonians, the Babylonian king or leader, but we know the name of this nobody, Abraham, and his name will never be forgotten, because he wasn't interested in his name, he was interested in God's name. Some very profound stuff here that's relevant to our modern society. The reason for these stories is to show not only how God worked then, but how God works now outside the church. Some of the modern commentaries develop this at quite good length. The person who pioneered much of the interpretation of this is a great German Old Testament scholar, Klaus Westermann, if you want to look at his commentary. Sometimes he overplays it, and there's features there that I disagree with, but in what I've given you is just a little bit of the pioneering work that he did. But paradoxically, you go back to the fathers in the early church, they said this, and the Jewish rabbis said it before them. Yes?
Is this Babylonian concept of going to the Ziggurat, the mountain, the temple of their god?
Yes.
And go there once a year to meet with Israel and offer those sacrifices, is that a precursor to what God established with the temple, and did he piggyback on that idea and make it holy and sanctified?
Yes. Now, I've said again and again how the Old Testament engages with pagan theology, but it turns it on its head. It revisions it. It revises it. The term that some scholars talk about is the great reversal. What happens is things are turned on their head here. Now, this thinking about the mountain of the gods is turned on its head at Mount Sinai, and then Mount Zion, which is the mountain of God, the place of the temple, but it's not the place in which you enter the heavenly realm. What happens in the temple in Jerusalem? Heaven comes down to earth. You'll notice it too in the story of Jacob, who comes to a place called Bethel, which means house of God, which is called the gate of heaven. Have you noticed that? This is Genesis chapter 28, the dream of Jacob. Jacob's ladder. Now, Jacob's ladder is totally the wrong picture, because what Jacob doesn't see is a ladder, but a stairway or a ziggurat. A stairway, and the angels ascend and descend on that stairway. Jacob's lying at the bottom of that stairway in his dream, and God comes down and stands next to the stairway, next to Jacob. What's the point of that story? Can you interpret it? Yeah?
Well, the heavenly realms come down to earth to meet Jacob where he is there.
That's so. The heavenly realm, the angels, and God himself comes to Jacob at that place, Bethel. So Bethel becomes a holy place, a sanctuary, the house of God. In fact, it's the second most important sanctuary in Israel. It's the main sanctuary of the northern kingdom, far more ancient than Jerusalem. And it's because of this, then it's called the gate of heaven. Everybody who comes to present their tithes at Bethel enters heaven here on earth. God comes down the invisible ladder, the angels come down the invisible ladder to meet with Jacob in order to bless him. So they don't, this is not astrological, it's not fixing your fate, your destiny. God mapping out every detail of Jacob's life, but what does God give Jacob as he lies there at the bottom of that ziggurat, that ladder? He gives him his promises. And his promises then determine the subsequent destiny of Jacob. and Jacob, who stands for Israel. So in place of astrology, you get prophecy. In place of, and prophecy focuses on God's promises. You get the link there? Some very, very profound stuff that's still relevant in the present world. To answer your question, just keep your eyes open for mountains all over the place. And it's not just in the Old Testament, but you go to the New Testament, and Matthew's Gospel, you have 5 very important mountains. Read Matthew's Gospel, just get your concordance and look up hill, mountain, and you'll find out that there's 5 very important mountain scenes, things that occur on mountains. Have a look at the mountains and what happens there, because in those mountains you get Matthew's theology of worship. Can you see how it comes about? This picture, the image of the heavenly mountain, the mountain of the Lord. And Jesus then, the Lord, does certain things on the mountain. Just the first clue, the first significant mountain scene is the Sermon on the Mount. You remember that? And you remember what the last one is?
Calvary.
No, that's not the last one. No, that's middle one. Ascension.
But this ascension isn't in Matthew, is it?
Yes. It's, the ascension, and it's not really the ascension, it's the mountain of commissioning, where Jesus commissions, not Moses, but he commissions the apostles. And that is redolent with references to worship. Okay, the mountain of the Lord. I'll come back to that again in significant places, but it's a very rich image, Nathan, if you want to follow it through. In fact, there's a possible, if you're really interested in it, you can do that for your essay. Old Testament essay, exploring the whole notion of the mountain of the Lord in the Old Testament.
Recently, I think it was last week, and I was driving over here on the radio, and they've reconstructed a very intricate wooden tower of great Islamic significance.
Yes.
It was burned. I don't know whether anyone heard it. I just heard a snatch of it, and it's based on very complicated mathematics and philosophical sort of concepts and so on. It was burned.
Yes.
And they've rebuilt it at great cost, and
Yes.
the Prince of Wales has been involved in it and so on. They've called the structure the Staircase to Heaven.
Staircase to Heaven. Yes, you get this picture all over the place. One of the, if any of you know anything about Buddhism, one of the most important Buddhist shrines is in Java. Now the name escapes me, Bohadavira or something like that, which is a stylized mountain, a huge temple complex. And you remember that Buddhism has to do with nirvana, in leaving the world of physical reality, entering the realm of nirvana, which is the pure spiritual realm. Okay, and so that ascent, that is understood in terms of an ascent into the realm, and quite often in Buddhism you get the picture of a mountain going upwards. So if in Buddhist countries you'll often find that Buddhist temples are either at the bottom of mountains or on top of mountains, quite often in caves at the bottom of the mountain or temples at the top of the mountain. This mountain imagery is part of that. But notice then how pagan religions, the movement always is this way. Old Testament, right from the beginning, what does God do? God comes down here, Yarav. And if you're interested in this, the key verb that you'll find again and again used of God is that God Yaravs. God comes down, and he comes down to Pequav, to visit his people. But this also has the idea of determining the destiny of his people. But destiny not astrologically, not in terms of fate, but in terms of blessing and deliverance. So God, Yoravs, comes down, this is the picture here, in order to visit his people. And part of God's visitation is that he visits the iniquity of people upon them, so that they bear the limited consequences of their actions. But Pequav can also mean he visits them in order to save them, to rescue them. This language all revolves, to get the full sense of it, you need to have this kind of picture in your mind. Okay, anything else on that? Now, to summarise the theology of the primeval history, if it's true that God created an orderly world, and that's what I've been emphasising, God created cosmos, not chaos, the obvious question is then, how come things are so disorderly in our world? Now, mind you, we do tend to overplay disorder. And it's interesting how our imagination and mind is always tuned to what's bad rather than what's good. Can I just illustrate? How many things went wrong for you yesterday? Murray? Can you think of any?
Seemed like everything for me.
Everything. You had a real bad nose day, bad hair day. 10 things for you? How many for you, Ben? No idea. Okay, that's very blessed. Tom?
2 or 3.
2 or 3. If I have more than 3 things go wrong, then I've had a disastrous day. I mean, not just little things, but, significant things. However, if you turn that around and you ask the question, how many things went right for you yesterday, and not just trivial things, could you possibly enumerate them? Billions of things went right for me yesterday. 2 or 3 things. No, it was a good day yesterday. But, even on a bad day, 3, maybe up to 10. That's the limit we've had. I don't know if anybody's got an advance on that. But can you see, what do we focus on? What do we notice? Things that go wrong rather than things that go right. So we can overplay, and this is not to diminish the significance of evil and disaster, tsunamis, floods, bushfires, etc., deaths and accidents, but what we do notice is when things are wrong. So it's funny, I don't notice when I'm healthy, I take it for granted, but as soon as I'm sick, then I think, the bottom's fallen out of my life. Which is partly, there's a funny thing in our minds and imagination. Remember that what's in Genesis? The imagination of every human heart is evil from its youth. We are attuned in the fallen state to picking up, noticing, even enjoying evil. But we're blind to what? Goodness. Mentally, imaginatively. C.S. Lewis reflected on that very deeply and said that for him was the surest mark of fall. And he also commented on another fact, which is this, that in terms of imagination, which are more attractive, good people or evil people? Which do you get more films, novels on? Bad people. We're fascinated by bad people. We find goodness boring, at least imaginatively. Imaginatively, it's very hard to depict goodness in any way that's convincing, that doesn't ring a false note to us. That we say, he's a goody two-shoes, it's too good to be true kind of stuff.
Why Dante's Inferno is what everyone reads.
But
not the poetry or the Paradise. It's the Inferno that's got all the juice in it.
Right, and that's why in terms of Milton, Paradise Lost is what's interested, not Paradise Regained. Nobody reads that.
It's very hard to get a copy of it, actually.
It is, but Paradise Lost is easy to get hold of. But Lewis also turns it around and he says, in fact, imaginatively, we're attracted to evil, we are bored by and turned off by what's good. But in experience, when it comes to people, what kind of people are we attracted to when we actually experience them? Good people, and we are repelled by evil people. So there's something funny about our imagination. Now, that just as an aside, however, I don't want to display down the ravage of sin and original sin. That's the answer then to the question, even though God created a good world, how come the world is stuffed up? The answer is human sin. Human beings are the cause of disorder and destruction in the world. Yet true, Satan is at work, but Satan couldn't do anything except through human agencies. So it all goes back to human beings. Second theme, the primeval history shows us how God's blessing works even in a sinful world. Human beings can abuse and misuse God's creation, but they cannot undo God's creation. Now, this is a profound paradox. Evil is the perversion of what's good, but even when evil perverts the good, it cannot destroy God's good creation. Let me illustrate from the area of sexuality. A rape, which is a real perversion of sexuality, can result in blessing the birth of a human being. And that human being's not a monster, is no less human than a person who's born in wedlock. Human beings can abuse and misuse God's creation terribly, but even the abuse does not abolish the use of it, the nature of it. And that goes through so many things in our world and is a fundamental Christian category, by the way, that you need to take into mind in your whole ethics and your attitude towards the world. It's very often that we can fall into pagan ways of thinking that everything is evil, or physical things are evil, or certain substances are evil. Secondly, at the most, human beings can pervert or abuse God's creation. They can't uncreate the world. Secondly, the amazing thing is that God brings good out of evil. God brings good out of evil. And his blessing continues and balances out the evil that human beings do. Thirdly, and this is very profound and important, God manages the consequences of sin by limiting them. So, for example, take capital punishment. If a human being kills another human being, that human being's life is forfeited. Now notice, however, retribution, justice, and this is a foundation, by the way, this is a foundation of all systems of justice. Eye for eye, tooth for a tooth, is natural justice. Human beings take the life of one human, that human being's life can be taken, if necessary. Now, you don't abolish murder that way. What you do at the best, you protect human life. You maintain human society, because the way a society reverts to anarchy is where human life is cheap and human beings are killed without consequence, or where you get a chain of retribution. You can see that happening in certain parts of the world in Africa. You know, what happened in Rwanda, anarchy was unleashed. It started off with simple payback, but getting out of hand. So God sanctions capital punishment in order to limit the consequences of evil. Or even in a more profound way, God gives animals to human beings, paradoxically, to eat. So you'd say to destroy animals, but this leads paradoxically to the preservation of animals, cynically. Fourthly, and this is very important, very profound, the Old Testament, contrary to all other pagan religions, says that all human beings come from common parents. We have a common ancestry. We are all one flesh, one blood. And that means that there are no superior or inferior nations. All human beings, without exception, are bearers of God's image despite the fall. Even the worst human being still bears the image of God, however in perverted form. One of the most brilliant treatments of that is by the great Russian novelist Solzhenitsyn in his wonderful, probably best novel, The First Circle, who depicts hell, or the Soviet system as hell, modelled on Dante's Inferno, in which you get one of the most brilliant sketches of Stalin, where Stalin is a prisoner within his own system, his own gulag. But the picture of Stalin is it's very sympathetic. It doesn't diminish his evil, but there is a certain grandeur about Stalin despite his wickedness. Now what he wants to show is that even though Stalin is probably the most wicked of all wicked human beings and one of the most wickedest of centuries, he's still in the image of God. He's not inhuman. He's still a human being like you and me. There but for the grace of God go you and I. So all human beings are bearers of God's image despite the fall. All are equally sinful and all are equally under God's judgment. One of the conceits of America is that they are the light upon the hill, God's chosen people here on earth, which makes them morally superior, and therefore they need to spread democracy and the blessings of democracy all over the world. Theological nonsense. Mind you, Australians have their own conceits equivalent to that. There are no superior nations. All people are equally sinful, all are under God's judgment. But at the same time, all are meant to equally to be recipients of God's blessings within the order of creation. There's no cursed nations. All are meant to enjoy the blessings that God provides in creation. Now, more generally, the primeval history then provides the foundation for God's dealing in a fallen world. So, if you want to understand the way God is at work out there in human history, the primeval history gives you some clue about how God is at work. It's not a detailed explanation, but gives you a vision of how God is at work in a fallen world. The climax of the primeval history is God's covenant with Noah, which is the foundation for God's order after the flood in a fallen world. Now notice that this order has three parts to it. There's the prominence of sacrifice. God deals with sin through sacrifice. He deals with some of the consequences of sin. So sin, instead of just getting out of hand, its consequences are dealt with by means of sacrifice. Secondly, God sanctions capital punishment, which then provides the basis for all social, political order and justice systems. Justice. I was going to say, when I used the term an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth, that is commonly misunderstood and misinterpreted in our society, and saying that terrible Old Testament teaching of an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth, which as if that sanctions payback, revenge. Eye for an eye is not a permission for you to lash out and to pay back, but it limits payback to proportion. So it must be just. There is such a thing as punishment, but it must be just and proportionate and limited. It has limited value.
It almost seems even unfair that they only received what they gave.
That's right.
Because they gave it when the victim was unwilling, and it was a violent act, But justice is never fair. Yeah.
And if you think human justice is fair, you're going to be disappointed. And that's the story of human justice right from the beginning, that you might get justice, but no justice is ever fair. You won't find fairness in any system of justice. Yes, there's something inherently unfair about that. Right, now lastly, why is it that Genesis doesn't go straight from the fall of Adam and Eve to the call of Abraham? It could quite easily have done it. Missed out all these chapters. Well, what's the function of these chapters in the whole of Old Testament theology? They force us to interpret Israel's history, which begins with Abraham, in the light of God's history with the whole of humanity. Israel and humanity and Israel belong together. You can't understand God's dealings with humanity apart from Israel. You can't understand God's dealings with Israel and the church apart from God's dealings with humanity. That is part of the context of everything that follows, and you will misunderstand everything that follows if you don't see it within this context. Take this out, and it looks as if God has favourites, and as if he is establishing Israel as the super nation, the privileged nation, the blessed nation, and he damns all other nations. It can be very easily misread in that direction. But God chooses Abraham. He chooses Israel so that Abraham will be a blessing to all the nations. And it continues that theme of blessing, which begins with creation and is not lost with the fall. Okay, any questions on the primeval history before we have a look at God's call of Abraham? Any question? Okay, let's have a break.